This tour isn't going to be anything like a regular tour. I will be taking you to some very important sites: Hell, the Temple Mount, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But rather than talking about the general history of each site, I will be talking about a key element, an idea that connects them all. As you will have gathered from the title, the idea connecting them all is sacrifice. This term is directly linked to the first instance of love and the first murder in the Bible. And above all, it is linked to God, or rather, to the gods. Most tours of Jerusalem start at Jaffa Gate. There is so much to see inside the city that most people don't take the time to turn around and visit Hell. Let's head there now. Welcome to Hell. I'm sure you didn't think it will look like this. This valley here is called Gai Ben Hinnom, but you know it as Gehenna, Gehenom, Hell, because this is where children were sacrificed to the Molech. The Molech was a Canaanite god, or the ceremony's name itself. It is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the worst possible place, Hell, is associated with a place of child sacrifice. The idea of sacrificing children was common in many cultures. Today, we associate it primarily with South American cultures, but it actually occurred throughout the ancient world, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Far East. And when you have a cultural phenomenon that is practiced in lots of different civilizations, then it must be satisfying a really fundamental, deeply rooted human need. But we're not in a Mayan temple in Mexico. We're here in Jerusalem. So let's see what the Bible says about what happened here. They have built the high places of Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. Something I did not commend, nor did it enter my mind. So beware, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer call it Tophet or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter, for they will bury the dead in Tophet until there is no more room. These were the angry words of Jeremiah, describing God's contempt with these ceremonies. But the biblical figure who brought humanity, or the Western world, out of this dark era of child sacrifice was Abraham. And to learn more about that, we need to go to Mount Moriah. From the valley of death, from the lowest place, we will take the stairway to heaven to the Temple Mount. A technical comment: the Waqf, the Muslim authorities, won't allow me to use a tripod, so the video quality won't be the best. So I'm here on the Temple Mount, which was built around the peak of Mount Moriah. There are many layers of history to uncover here. If you want to know all about it, then get my Jerusalem crash course. You will be so much smarter after you've watched it, but we are here to talk about sacrifice. And I want to tell you a few things that blew my mind when I first heard them. Mount Moriah's peak is under the Dome of the Rock. According to the Bible, this is where the story of the binding of Isaac took place. Did it really happen here? It is up to you whether you believe it or not. But again, the story resonates so much because it touches on this profound question of faith and sacrifice. What would you sacrifice for what you believe in? Would you sacrifice what you love, what you truly love? And I use this word because the first time the word love appears in the Bible is right before God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. I find it interesting that the first time the word love appears, it is not a reference to one's love for God or the love between a man and a woman, but the love a father has for his son. And just a minute before, he is told to sacrifice him. Now, the traditional understanding of this story talks about it as a test of Abraham's faith. But I think we see it as the hardest test because we live in a time that doesn't accept child sacrifice. At the time of Abraham, it was acceptable. The main character in this story is not Abraham, but God. More than it's being a test for Abraham, it is God saying, "You love your son, and you are a true believer, and I don't need child sacrifice anymore." And what does he do instead? He sacrifices a ram, an animal. And this is the next phase. And we don't need to go to anywhere else to talk about it, because Mount Moriah, where we are right now, is also the place where the temple was built. When talking about the temples, guides often focus on the most important room inside it, the Dvir, where the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments were. But I want to focus on what was somewhere over here, the altar. Now, this is something that I found so interesting when I first heard about it. Today, when we think about connecting to God, to the divine, we think about praying, we think about meditating, about sitting quietly. But the main activity in the Jewish temple, the same as in the Greek and Roman temples, was animal sacrifice. You communicate with the gods by offering up animals. The temples were basically massive slaughterhouses. During the high holidays, thousands of animals were offered up here. It was the opposite of quiet. A queue of people, each holding an animal, the fire burning, the meat on the altar. Water channels were built to bring water from springs 20 kilometers away from Jerusalem to the Temple Mount to wash all the blood from the altar. Throughout history, animal sacrifice was probably the main way humanity established communicating with the gods. The first murder in the Bible is all about sacrifice, and it comes very early on. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates the world, and in chapter 4, Cain murders Abel. And what was the reason for the murder? They had both offered a sacrifice to God. Cain offered crops, and Abel offered animals. God accepted Abel's sacrifice, the animals, but didn't accept Cain's. The Bible doesn't tell us why. Cain is envious of his brother and murders him. There are many open questions relating to this story, but three things are clear. So, the first murder in the Bible draws on the idea of sacrifice, and God accepted the animal sacrifice. For 3,000 years, animal sacrifice was the primary way in Judaism to offer thanks to the Lord. And the sacrifices mainly took place here in Jerusalem. There were lots of different kinds of sacrifices, but most of them involved people bringing animals, paying a fee to the priests, and getting back some of the meat. But there was one kind of sacrifice where the whole animal was burnt. The meat wasn't eaten, and it was burnt until nothing was left of it. In Hebrew, the name is Korban Olah, and in English, the name is Holocaust. The word Holocaust derives from two words in Greek, holos, which means whole, and kostos, which means burnt. It is not only the word Holocaust. The word scapegoat was also directly connected to this. The scapegoat was a sacrifice made during Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, which was and is one of the most important days in the Jewish calendar. Two goats were chosen, and the priest would cast lots. One goat was offered to God on the altar, and the other one had all the sins and the impurity of the Jews placed on it, was taken to the desert to Mount Azazel and thrown off the top of it. The scapegoat was an extremely important annual ritual for hundreds of years. In English, we say, go to hell. And in Hebrew, we say, lech le'azazel, or go to Azazel, which is the mountain from which the scapegoat was thrown off a cliff, carrying all the sins of the community. Sins and sacrifice go a long way together. Now there is no temple and no altar here. And to understand why, we need to discuss two events that happened here in the 1st century CE. Both changed the way we think about sacrifice and communicating with God. And these two events are connected. The first is the destruction of the temple in the year 70. The Romans destroyed the Jewish temple, and Judaism was transformed from a temple-based religion to a synagogue-based religion, from a religion based on animal sacrifice to a religion based on prayers, from priests to rabbis. And you won't believe who the first documented person to be called a rabbi was. Anyway, the names of the Jewish prayers today have the names of the different sacrifices offered in the temple 2000 years ago. So the prayers are, in a way, a manifestation of the animal sacrifices. 40 years before the temple was destroyed, one Jew offered a different interpretation of the idea of sacrifice. He was the first documented person to be called rabbi, and he was Jesus. Now, wait, I know what many Jews are thinking. Am I, Oren, a Messianic Jew? Am I trying to make Jews believe in Jesus? And the answer is no and no. I'm Jewish, and I personally don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. If you want to know what Jews think about Jesus, then watch this video. I think it is one of my best. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that I've dug myself a hole here and fallen right into it. Some Jews aren't going to like the fact that I'm talking about Jesus, and some Christians aren't going to like the fact that I don't believe in Jesus. My personal beliefs are not relevant here. I'm just a good-looking tour guide. What is relevant here is that if we want to talk about the idea of sacrifice, we need to talk about the society Jesus lived in. And as a Jew, he lived in a Jewish society at a very troubled time, a time of disaster and upheaval. So while the Jews who followed the rabbis after the destruction of the temple said that prayers would replace animal sacrifice, Jesus and his followers, who were also Jewish, proposed a different path by saying that Jesus was offering himself. Jesus sacrificed himself for humanity's sins, and that is how he freed us from the original sin. I will continue discussing this once we are off the Temple Mount. I don't need to walk too far because the Via Dolorosa is right outside the Temple Mount. So this street is called the Via Dolorosa, and it starts where Jesus was tried and sentenced and ends where he was crucified. I won't get into the history of the Via Dolorosa and how we know which part of it makes sense and which doesn't. I talk about all that in my Jerusalem course. Now I want to talk about the Amish. When I was 27, I lived with an Amish family for a few months. Once during the Saturday teaching, one of the elders talked about the 3 S's in life: suffering, service, and sacrifice. And I remember saying to myself, I've never thought about my life in those terms, but I won't just dismiss it. I will put it in an empty cell in my mind and come back to it one day. And I have no doubt that this video is being made as a direct result of that sermon. I think, and I might be wrong here, that in Judaism there is more focus on following the rules of the Torah and less focus on those notions of suffering and sacrifice. But there is suffering in life, and trying to run away from the suffering in pursuit of personal happiness will most likely end up in more suffering. By serving others or a higher cause, you put yourself and your needs in second place. I can say for myself that having kids was good for my mental health. Me no longer being at the very center of my life is the best thing that ever happened to me. Anyway, you can take these ideas in many directions. And the Via Dolorosa, or the way of the suffering in Latin, is a path that lends itself to reflecting on these terms. The Via Dolorosa ends in the place where Jesus was crucified, Golgotha. He is humiliated by the Romans as they put a crown of thorns on his head and make him carry his own cross, the means of his own execution. In Judaism, the Messiah will bring salvation. He will be victorious. And in Christian thought, the Messiah died in the most humiliating and painful way. Jesus sacrificed himself for our sins, paving our way to salvation through his death, his sacrifice. At the beginning of the video, I said that sacrifice was very common in many cultures, and I've focused on how it evolved in Judaism and Christianity. But people's need for sacrifice go beyond the Judeo-Christian world. I think, and these are just my thoughts, that in the ancient world, people used sacrifice to deal with guilt and shame and envy. It is a way of releasing these powerful feelings. I take my guilt, I take my shame, and I take it out on this poor animal. Today, we have no ceremonial mechanism with which to express these feelings. I find the evolution of sacrifice and our changing perception of the idea really fascinating. In many ways, we have advanced, no more child sacrifice, but maybe along the way, we have lost touch with a very basic need. I have barely scratched the surface of these ideas and all that they mean, and have just made the connection between the sides. But they do, of course, go a lot deeper and find us in different places in life. I hope that you enjoyed this rather unusual tour. If you want to know everything I say on my Jerusalem tour, then consider getting my Jerusalem Crash Course. The link is here below. See you next week. Yalla bye.